Hello again, gang. KR King here, helping you homebrew your own D&D campaign. And today I'm going to talk about villains, understanding villains, creating realistic villains, or some people would say sympathetic villains, although I'm not going to go quite that far, as you'll see. But the idea is that oftentimes in D&D, we first start off and we have evil, protagonists or antagonists against our players. They're just wholly evil. They do everything to destroy the players and, fight to the death. They don't have any other objectives, it seems, than just to kill the players, right? Or if their objectives are take over the world or whatever, the players are just in their way. And what happens is, when you do writing and stuff and you create storylines, you begin to realize that villains that are more complex, villains that have motivations, villains that have flaws, which are basically good qualities, they're more interesting for the reader or the viewer. So there's this movement that you should do that in Dungeons and Dragons. We should understand where the villains are coming from, what makes them behave this way, and in that sense, they become more sympathetic. So I'm going to use some examples taken from real life and literature to talk about where this can go, what sort of villains you're going to create when you try to understand villains, understand their motivations. But I'm also going to talk about the limitations of this point of view in terms of villains being bad because they're bad. So I'm going to use one example of the classic Clint Eastwood film, The Outlaw Josie Wales, where he is a former militia guy from Missouri, Quantrill's Raiders and this sort of thing. You can look up the history of that. These were Missourians which stayed with the Union that were mad about this, and they formed these militia units. They were harassing the Union Army, and they also committed all sorts of atrocities and whatnot. But this is Clint Eastwood, movie star, and they say to them, hey, come on in. The Union Army says, come on in. We're going to disarm everyone. The war is over, basically. Clint refuses to go in, the only man. Now, the Redlegs, a notorious Union militia sympathizers, Missourians that were sympathetic to the Union, are there, and they machine gun down these guys, so Clint was proven right. And he's an outlaw, and he wants to make it to Indian Territory, which was Oklahoma at that time, to escape. So this is the outlaw that is the government's chasing, who, of course, to the viewer, is not an outlaw at all. Yeah, his farm was destroyed by Union troops. That's why he joined the militia. He wasn't, an honest, law-abiding citizen before the war, but he refuses to surrender to the federal government. And this becomes the reason that he then, he's taking people on, but we don't see this sort of atrocities. We assume that he never committed any atrocities during this period. So is this just a totally sympathetic, almost a good guy? And could you have this as a bandit, let's say, that's been the king or the city guard or whatever, you have a corrupt king, has taken his lands or, killed his brother or something, and he becomes a bandit, but we understand his motivations. Well, if you're going to do that, then is he stealing to support himself? And if he is, who's he stealing from? Is he stealing exclusively from the government? And what is the story behind, if you have an evil king, then the players may want to unite with this bandit chieftain to take down the king. Or is he doing things? Is he enjoying being a bandit? And this is the thing. If he's just a sympathetic person, then the king is the evil guy, not the bandit. But if the bandit is enjoying this, or if the bandit says to the players, he thinks, oh, you guys are aligned with the king, and he takes all their stuff and doesn't really check it out, or other people, here you get into that fuzzy line here. What sort of activities does he take? And you want to think about this if you're trying to create a sympathetic villain, because if he's too sympathetic, he's not a villain, he's a good guy. And that villainy means that despite the origins of his villainy, he's still doing things that are against the law, and there are innocent victims of his activities. So another classic villain of cinema is Darth Vader, right? In the first two films, especially, he is just portrayed as a evil, servant of the emperor, and totally evil, will kill anyone who gets in his way, strangle them. His only goal is to crush the rebellion in any way he wants. Then famously, he announces, spoiler alert here, that Luke, I'm your father. He's the corrupt Anakin that was corrupted by the dark side of the Force. Then you get into the prequels and you find out the whole story of Anakin, and this is where a lot of people object to this. They're sort of like, Darth Vader was much better when he was just an evil guy. I don't need to hear his background. In fact, this motivated the infamous or famous prequels, whatever you think about them, in terms of creating then that once you have these three, that colors the Darth Vader of the later films. And it's not as satisfying to people. People just want him to be evil. Understanding what brought Darth Vader to his evil activities is not that interesting. And this is something you want to think about if you're going to create a background to explain why a villain has become evil. You are either going to run into the players that just scoff at this, so what? As we'll see, I'm going to talk about another real life example. Or then there's that blurring of, well, then why does he do the evil that he does with this background? What is this serving? What purpose? And is there some good purpose behind this as well? So there is an actor, Hector Elizondo, who on YouTube talks about being with Lee Marvin in a film years ago. I'll put a link to it down in the description. I had the opportunity, I was at a benefit years ago in LA, and Hector Elizondo happened to sit at my table. He talked about making the film Pelham 1, 2, 3 in the 70s, which he mentions in this clip. We didn't talk about the Lee Marvin thing, but he does in this video. And what he says is when he interviewed Lee Marvin, or he didn't interview him, he was on set, and he said to Mr. Marvin, I just enjoy it. And he said, I love the bad guys you play. And of course, Lee said, hey, to this young actor at the time, there are no bad guys. He said, did you ever know any bad guys? Where'd you grow up? And he said, well, Hector said, I grew up in Harlem, New York. He said, well, did you know any bad guys? He said, I knew a few. And he goes, but did they think they were bad? And Hector said, no, they didn't. He said, yeah, they thought I was doing the best I can. I had bad luck. I had people out to get me. I had to become a criminal or do bad things because of the circumstances of my life. But I myself am not bad. I did whatever it took to survive. And if you can convey perhaps not so much the childhood of your villain, or perhaps you can, but something about them. This is where the fatal flaw, the hero has a fatal flaw. And the Greeks was hubris, was pride, right? But you can also they have a short temper and they get really frustrated and they yell at people and turn them away, or something like this, impatient with others, or they have an issue with their father, even though they're the hero, and it causes them, when they see something, it triggers them to do something bad. Well, a villain's fatal flaw is usually a good quality. Now, it can be pride, it can be arrogance, it can be you can trick them by, flattery or something, and then they'll listen to you while you're scheming. But a true fatal flaw for a villain is some good quality. They love their siblings. They love their child. They have a weakness for something that when they see it in someone else, they instantly they hesitate, or they can't quite kill them or attack them. And this is something that you can use, the protagonist uses to, even though the villain has much more power, they figure out this fatal flaw and they work in there. And what does that come from? That comes from some humanity. Something about the villain that isn't cartoony, that isn't like a Marvel superhero that's just evil, evil, evil. But in the final category, I'm going to use the example of a real-life villain who I think, despite all these things that I'm talking about, is just evil. And this would be Charlie Manson, right? A very famous villain of American history. And because he's so famous, the circumstances of his crimes, we know a lot about him. We know all about his childhood. His mother was a prostitute. He never knew his father. She used to leave him at bars when she would get drunk and whatnot. He spent his whole childhood in youth homes and then juvenile halls, and he was horribly mistreated. He was released and devolved into petty crimes. He was married briefly, and he had a son. But again, he became a pimp with prostitutes, went back to jail, San Quentin, was finally released in 1967, and had with no means of getting a job, nothing, and he drifts out and into the hippie scene of San Francisco and then L.A., and we know the rest. He gets these women around him because of his pimping background. And at this point, he may or may not have committed murders. He was more of a petty criminal. Obviously, there are all these drugs going on and everything, and this thing where he's this family guy, running this group. And then things shift because Charlie Manson, two of his women in his group met Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, who at that time was as famous, just maybe right below the Beatles. We forget about that with the Beach Boys, but he was very famous. And then Manson moves in and lives with Dennis Wilson for, I think, 6 months or something. Because the thing about Charlie Manson was he played the guitar, he thought of himself as a songwriter, and it was unbelievable. This also cemented his thing with these girls because he was this petty criminal doing them. But Dennis Wilson and all the stuff he said about I'm like Jesus, I'm this guru, and he met one of the most famous people in the world. They're living in his house. And Dennis decides he likes some of Charlie's songs. He's going to record them. He hooks him up with a producer that he'd used, Terry Melcher. And this is where Charlie's true personality, when Terry Melcher said, well, change this song, whatever, he said, no way. He brought a gun into the studio, and Terry Melcher said, get the hell out. His recording career was over. Dennis Wilson told him to leave. Dennis Wilson actually did record one of his songs. He shifted the lyrics and took his own name. He paid for it. And Charlie was embittered by this. He had had this chance at fame. And so the Tate LaBianca murders, now again, there's people that say the helter-skelter thing and the war that he was going to bring on. But it really looks to a lot of people like he was mad at Terry Melcher, and that's where Sharon Tate was renting that house, her and Roman Polanski, and he went up there to kill him for doing this to him. And having said all that, understanding Charlie Manson's background, understanding what drove him to do these murders, understanding everything about him, he still is totally evil. And I say that because there are many, many people who, unfortunately, in our society have all the same things happen to them as children and whatnot that happened to Charlie Manson. And you know what? They didn't become criminals. They didn't go on a mass murder spree. They didn't get a whole bunch of other people involved and blow their minds with drugs and whatever, and who are all now, you know, a lot of them have died, but they're still in jail for these crimes. They just lived a life as best they could as a normal person. So here's the thing. Your villain, whatever his background, however sympathetic, whether you want to look at the background of Darth Vader or the outlaw Josie Wales or Charlie Manson or whatever, and however much you want to love them like an actor does or understand that they don't think they're evil, sometimes they're just evil. They're just bad through and through. And you don't have to worry about the players having to think, oh, you know, are you running as a GM and saying, now, how can I do this such that this has got this subtle background and this is why they're a criminal? You don't need to care. There are some villains that are just evil. And remember that when you're creating. Yes, it's more interesting to have a multi-layered sort of villain, but it doesn't always have to be that way because you get yourself tied up in knots trying to figure this kind of stuff out. Sometimes you just got Charlie Manson and you just run with it. And if you like what you've seen on my channel, please subscribe. Tell me about some villains in the comments that you've created, whether you like the idea of always making them sympathetic, understanding, love your villains, that kind of thing. Or if you're just like, no, I just want to have an evil villain and the players are going to kill him or her or whatever it is an aberration or something. I don't need to worry about that. And in that process, my friends, you will keep playing D&D and hopefully you will tell somebody else about it.